Hey, Push Nation, it's Mr. Majewski here. I'm here with Mr. Schnitzel. We're co-teaching today. You know, Schnitzy, I gotta tell you, brother, slavery, such an important topic. Maybe one of the most important topics in all of American history. I think you're going to agree with me. Anyways, folks, as we go through these notes, Schnitzel, you're not into this, huh? You want your pepperoni and you want to get down. Okay, good. Bye. Folks, anyways, as we're going through these notes, what we're going to do is I'll indicate when I switch a slide. I'll indicate next slide every time I switch a slide. And also, I'll try to indicate when I move from one page to another on the notes. So you can follow along with your notes. You can also follow along with the PowerPoint as well. And of course, hopefully you're going to watch and or be able to listen to me. Folks, we're going to begin today with slide number 6. That's theme 1. Alrighty. I'll give you a moment there to get caught up. And theme 1 is the rise of the Cotton Kingdom in the South and how it resulted in this explosion of slavery that we're already familiar with. Alrighty, so let's begin. Of course, we're going to look at the reasons for the rise of the Cotton King Cotton, or the Cotton Kingdom, as it was also known. Prior to 1793, let's remember the Southern economy, very weak, very depressed. Very unmarketable for the most part. The soil had been ravaged. A lot of folks felt like slavery was on the decline. Of course, all of that changes with the implementation and the invention of the cotton gin. Of course, cotton production then becomes incredibly profitable. You need more slaves in order to pick that cotton that much quicker. Alrighty, next slide, please. We go to this chart that indicates the growth of slavery and cotton in the United States, as you can see. 1790, very few slaves, virtually no cotton at all. And then juxtapose that with 1860. You can see how the cotton bales and the number of slaves has increased into the millions. Alrighty, the multiple millions. Next slide, please. Again, cotton comes to surpass tobacco, rice, and indigo. Alrighty, it dominates all agriculture in the South. And of course, it turned into a cash crop industry, kind of a factory economy where they mass produced as much cotton as possible. The western states are going to expand. We call that the Gulf Coast, down the Gulf of Mexico. Those states especially are going to be reliant on cotton. They're dependent on it, as we're going to see. They had the most slaves. They were often the harshest, all right, because of this reliance, especially on cotton in the West. There was a huge domestic slave trade. Of course, we understand why, because, of course, the international slave trade was abolished in 1808. That was, remember, part of the Constitution. And so what that meant was plantation owners, slave owners, are simply going to, turn those plantations into, well, baby-making kind of factories. Alrighty, and that's how they're going to produce the next generation of slaves. Next slide, please. Here we have, of course, a slide showing a slave who has been captured, right? Of course, reminding you again, we go to the domestic slavery because of the importation of slaves is abolished. Trade. Well, of course, the cotton was exported, as we've already mentioned, to New England, but also, of course, it goes to England as well. Remember, England was our biggest buyer of Southern cotton. And then, of course, the South would use the money they got from those sales of cotton to buy all of the manufactured goods and food from the North and the West. New England and England itself, the country, were very reliant on Southern cotton because, well, let's face it, both of those places had textile industries that were reliant on acquiring cotton. Again, 4 out of 5 bales of cotton that went to Britain came from the American South. Alrighty, of course, the North and the South were both dependent in a way on slave labor because of this weird relationship where the cotton went also to the North to be turned into textiles as well. Again, cotton was a major part of our economy. In fact, it dominated exports. 50%, over 50% of all exports in the world that we sent overseas were cotton. It was all cotton. Folks, that's unheard of. Alrighty, today, if you have more than maybe 5 or 10% of your economy based off of one product, that's considered a lot. So 57% was huge. Next slide. Again, an excellent image here that I would encourage you to take a look at. It kind of shows the difference in the number of slaves, the number of the amount of cotton being produced, and then once again, as well, you definitely want to see how it spreads. This map, this image here also shows you how it spreads westward and where it was most dominant. Okay. Cotton exports, again, as you can see, a huge part of the overall exports of the country. Next slide, by the way. And as you can see, those exports go way up, and that's almost exclusively because of this growth of cotton. Where is the cotton being produced? Well, of course it's being produced in the South. We know that, all right? But the question is where in the South? The answer is, for the most part, the deep South, all righty? The more south they go, the more dependent, the more reliant on cotton they are going to be. The more slaves they're going to have. Usually the stricter they were on their slaves, the harsher they were on their slaves, all right? Let's begin with this discussion about the three Souths. Now, I know that's a weird term for you. You might not be familiar with that terminology, what we mean by the three Souths. So begin. Generally speaking, the further north you went when you were in the southern states, the less reliant they were on cotton. The climate was a little cooler, the more northern you got. The fewer the slaves, maybe more tobacco still being grown, alrighty? They didn't have as much need for slave labor because they weren't growing as much cotton in those border states, the states closest to the north. The further south you went, it was the opposite. Generally, the warmer, the more humid, the better, climate for the growing of cotton. They had more slaves. They were more committed to slavery because they were more committed to the cotton trade. All right, so we refer to the South almost in three sections: the border South, the middle South, I guess you could call it, and then the deep South. Alrighty, and then you also need to understand, look, in many mountainous areas of the South, there were actually whites, very poor whites, southern whites. We call them Appalachian whites or mountain whites, who didn't have any need whatsoever for slavery. They lived in the mountains and the hills. They had small farms. They grew food for themselves. They were completely removed from Southern society. They kind of resented plantation owners. Shoot, they resented slaves too. Alrighty. And so ultimately, many of these mountain whites actually are going to side with the North when the war breaks out because they were so opposed to slavery. Alrighty. Anyways, there were some sections that were less reliant or maybe not reliant at all on slavery in the South, but obviously they were dominated. They were outnumbered by the slaveholders and the incredible power the slaveholders have. Alrighty, what this meant, of course, was as time goes by, you're going to see more and more slaves kind of moving south because, again, those southern states become more and more dependent on slave labor, and the more northerly southern states do not. Let's change slides, alrighty, and then I believe we can change slides right again. Maybe we can't. Okay. So we're going to begin now. By the way, we are on slide 17, alrighty. And actually, we're going to move to slide 18, alrighty, and you can see with the map here that shows what I mean by these three Souths. Of course, the northern states are in blue; those are free states, alrighty. And then, as you can see, there are the states that border the free states. We call those kind of the border states: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. They were the least reliant on slavery, alrighty. In fact, these states are going to side with the Union during the war. They're going to stay loyal to the North, alrighty. Then, of course, you have Virginia, you have Arkansas, you have Tennessee, you have North Carolina, the lighter red states on that map. They're kind of in the middle, alrighty. More dependent on slavery than, the ones above them, alrighty, but less dependent than the Deep South. And then, of course, look down at the bottom there in the deep red. Those are the Deep South, or the lower southern states. They're the most reliant on slave labor. Of course, it begins with South Carolina in the east, all the way over to Texas in the west. All right, next slide, slide 19. The border South, again, we've already kind of identified those states. Alrighty, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri. Plantations were very scarce. Cotton cultivation was very scarce, almost non-existent. Tobacco was the main crop, as it had been historically. Farms were much smaller. Alrighty, there is some grain production as well in these areas. Again, slaves make up only 17% of the population. Alrighty, those who owned slaves only had about 5 each, alrighty, which is actually relatively small when you compare them to the other regions. Next slide. 21% of the border South blacks were free. That's the largest amount, alrighty. Almost half of all the free blacks that existed in the South who lived in these border states, these four. Only 22% of the white population, white families, actually owned a slave, so most did not, almost 80%, alrighty. Again, very few slaves, smaller farms, very few plantations, and the people that did own them had less of them, alrighty. The very little industry that was produced, most of it was produced in these 4 states. Alrighty, which makes a lot of sense. The further south you went, the more agricultural, the more relying on cotton. Next slide, slide 21. Let's go to the Middle South. Again, the Middle South is kind of in the middle. Alrighty, and I think it's just as simple to say it as that. Alrighty, plantations are going to be larger than the border. Alrighty, states. They're going to be a little bit more reliant on slave labor and on cotton than the border states, but less than the Deep South. Alrighty, we'll look at some of these numbers here. Next slide, slide 22. 30% of the population were slaves here. Alrighty, 8 slaves per slaveholder, so slightly more. 30 than the border states. 36% of white families own slaves. Alrighty, so again, a higher percentage than in those border states. Again, so it's more reliant. Alrighty, now we go to the lower south. Those are South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Most slaves lived in this area. In fact, they called it the Black Belt or the Cotton Belt in the South, alrighty, because there were so many concentration of slaves there. Plantations were the most common there, alrighty. They were very common. Large farms, large plantations. Cotton was king here, overwhelmingly. Almost 95% of all of the cotton that was produced here, was produced here. Alrighty, now of course they're still going to grow those old things like rice and indigo, maybe a little sugar as well, alrighty. These are going to be the first states to secede from the Union, alrighty, and then they're going to be followed by the Middle South after that, alrighty. Again, 47%, almost half the population owned slaves. For every slave owner, they owned about 12 slaves, so more. 5 in the middle, in the border states, 8 per slave owner in the Middle South, 12 per slave owner in the Deep South. Only 2% of blacks were free, 43% of families owned slaves. Alrighty, so a large number. On top of that, a huge amount of the wealthiest Southerners, the huge wealthy planters, were located in these states as well. They produced the least industry in the entire southern region because, well, they were making most of the cotton. Alrighty, speaking of that cotton, let's go to the peculiar institution. That's going to be slide number 25. Peculiar means weird, alrighty, and this was kind of the unofficial term Southerners used to describe slavery where it existed. They called it a peculiar institution. Yeah, it's strange when you look at it from the outside, when you're not a Southerner, but it's our institution, it's our tradition, and it might be peculiar to you, but it's normal to us, and that's why we need it, and we're going to keep it so much, alrighty? Anyways, it was kind of just a way they referred to slavery in the South. Yeah, it's a peculiar institution, but it's our institution, alright? Anyways, the South, as we know, was ruled by those wealthy planters. It had been since the 16 and 1700s, since the colonial times, and that remained, alrighty? Again, in 1850, there were less than 2,000 families that had more than 100 slaves. I think there's this feeling that all Southerners owned slaves and they had these huge plantations. That's not the case. A whole bunch of power was in the hands of relatively few, just a couple thousand people. Alrighty? Slide 26. So the South was the least democratic of the regions. I think we understand that, right? I mean, since a lot of power is in the hands of very few, makes sense, right? There's not going to be a lot of democracy there. Alrighty, huge social gaps between the richest and poorer classes. It was very stratified. One of the big problems is there's no education. There's no schooling to even the gap for people to jump from one class to another. Remember, schooling was very poor throughout the South. Alrighty, here's the thing. Planters and their society, planters and Southern ladies, these elites, they almost felt like they were the knights of American society, like the knights and the damsels. They oftentimes romanticized their lifestyle and their tradition. They had these elegant balls and parties and ceremonies and celebrations. They formed these military academies where they would send their children to learn to be soldiers. It was almost like knights and nobles, alrighty? And they almost, created this class of nobility out of the planters that existed. All right, and that makes sense because remember, many of the original planters themselves were nobles from Europe. The plantation system, of course, is what the South relied on. It's what they depended on. It's how they were able to mass produce all this cotton for sale. It required a whole lot of slaves, and slaves are expensive. So a lot of Southern money was tied up in slavery. We're going to look at how much a slave was. You're going to be really fascinated by that slide. It was risky to own slaves. Hey, they might die. Life expectancy wasn't very long in much of the South. Also, other problems with it. Hey, it's a one-trick pony. It's a one-crop economy. When times are good, they're going to be really good economically. When times are bad, oh, it's going to be a disaster. Alrighty, everybody's going to suffer because everybody's dependent on one thing to drive the economy. Alrighty. Anyways, that's one of the reasons why the North benefits more, because they're able to diversify more. So they weren't as hard hit during tough economic times if one part of the economy was knocked out. There's a lack of immigration, let's remember. Oh, new slide, slide 28. There's a lack of immigration in the South, alrighty, because there's no reason for Southerners to go, or for immigrants to go to the South. They already have a labor population. The slaves, only 4% of our foreign-born population was from the South, or went to the South, alrighty. Slave labor was was far cheaper than hiring immigrants, and so Southerners a lot of times, once they owned the slaves, they were not going to bring immigrants in and pay them as well. Didn't make sense, so ultimately, most Northerners or most immigrants stayed up north. There were 4 million slaves that lived in the United States by 1860. Alrighty, that was 4 times the amount that had existed in 1800. All right, when there was 1 million. Again, not despite the fact that there was no legally, you weren't allowed to import slaves in. Now, there was some illegal importation, there was some smuggling, alrighty, but almost all of those 4 million slaves that are going to be produced are going to be produced on the plantation, alrighty. They overbred slaves. Slaves overbred, alrighty, sometimes encouraged by the master, sometimes on their own, alrighty. Of course, many times whites, as well, engaged in this behavior. They reproduced with slaves and had children, mulatto children as well. Alrighty. Look, slaves were very valuable. They were seen as really a valuable asset. They were seen as a measure of your wealth in the South. How many slaves you had measured your importance, your wealth to other Southerners. Of course, slaves were sold at the slave auction. It was oftentimes reviled. We're going to look at some examples of that later in the year when we watch some movies. The slave auction, slaves come off the ship. They're going to be divided, of course. Many times families are broken up. This is done in public. They're oftentimes treated almost like cattle, almost like animals as they're being inspected before they are split and sold off. Slide 32. Here is a slide, an image actually, that shows you an auction for slaves. Alrighty, as you can see, they're going to be selling 91 slaves, potential slaves, off here. This is it looks like it's in 1860. I know the date there at the bottom looks like 1869. I believe it's actually 1860, which would make sense. Here we go. Next slide, slide 33. The value of the stock of slaves. Alrighty, so this shows you how much money was invested in slaves in terms of millions of dollars. Alrighty, and as you can see, we're talking millions and millions of dollars here that is being spent. Tens of millions, in some instances, hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent here and invested in slaves. Alrighty, so the Southerners spent a huge amount of their capital, their available money there. That's of course why they didn't innovate as much. Alright, here we go, slide 34. This shows you the value of a slave in 2004 dollars, but that's pretty close to today. In 1810, a slave cost $316. That would have been in, modern money about $4,500. Alrighty, so not a ton. Alrighty, you compare that with 1860. They're now worth $3,000 in 1860, which today would be, close to $60,000. Alrighty, so a slave would be worth about $60,000 today. At the peak in 1860 money. Alrighty. Anyways, kind of gives you an idea of what they were worth and how much higher in value they went up over time. Alrighty. Punishment was brutal, often to intimidate slaves. You didn't want them to run away. You wanted them to work as hard as possible. And so you did that a lot of times, or at least the Southerners did that a lot of times, with fear, with intimidation, with threats. Whipping was common. Beatings, violence, alrighty, was often a regular occurrence, especially in, again, those deep southern states, and especially the western southern states. What I mean there is Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Alabama. The harshest states by far. Alrighty, they develop a reputation for being particularly brutal, fierce, as some of those images in slide 35 definitely show you. Okay.